Welcome to the Future of Work, where we're focusing on the future of independent workers. And we really want to explore the theme, what can be done now to ensure that all independent workers thrive in the years ahead. This is a project we do here at reInvent with our partners Intuit. And I'm Pete Lyden, I'm the founder of reInvent. I'll be doing the interview today with Stefan Cassiral, who is the CEO of Upwork, which is a really interesting company that actually brings together companies that want to connect with independent workers and workers who want to connect with companies. And they're essentially a platform that actually makes that all happen, which is a really beautiful way to kind of talk about this real problem here that the challenges of the evolving system from employee relations to independent worker relations, and the systems that both government, policy, but tech companies and companies in general can adapt to that next world. So welcome to coming here.
Thank you for having me.
So give us a little story of Upwork, because if people who don't, a lot of people who are watching these kind of things are trying to wrap their heads around this whole space fresh. You might not be familiar with the background of what your company does.
Sure. So we are the world's largest freelancing website. So what that means is we connect 5 million businesses on one side with 12 million freelancers on the other. And we do this across 100 different categories, 5,000 different skills, and it's all about knowledge work, right? So what we help a small business do, as an example, is build a website or build a mobile app or write their blogs or build a bunch of Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, LinkedIn videos or what have you. It's really about digital skills that can be done remotely.
And these we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of skills. Are they essentially all kind of knowledge work, media-oriented skills, or are they actually connecting people who are doing a range of skills all the way down to...
So we've decided early on that we would focus on work that could be done online, could be done remotely. And as a result, we are focusing on knowledge work, professional services type of jobs that can be done from anywhere in the US or even potentially internationally. The big categories on the site include IT, people building mobile apps and websites and desktop software, enterprise software, all of that things, as well as design and marketing services. So anything from content, video, localization, graphic design, print, industrial design, those types of things. But then there's also a large series of other types of professional services. So this is also a place where you can find consultants, lawyers, accountants, recruiters, people to help you with customer support, sales, frankly, any type of job that somebody can do in front of a mobile device or in front of a laptop and potentially in a different part of the country or a different part of the world.
How about folks that you mentioned transcribing and stuff? How about folks, because when you talk about consultants or high-end, coders and things, people get one idea of a very high-end, probably well-paid kind of folks. Does it also, how far into the kind of guts of just everyday jobs would you go? Are there other just folks that would be making much less money, let's say, around what they're offering that are also on your site?
Yeah, I mean, the way we look at it is that the job market is a pyramid. There's a very small number of incredibly highly paid jobs at the very top, and they're the lawyers and the consultants and the AI experts and the data scientists. And then there's a much larger group of people closer to the bottom of the pyramid that make generally more money on Upwork than they would make through the local job market. That's what attracting people to come here, but are generally less qualified. However, in our case, it is still tied to knowledge work, right? So what we don't do is what, for instance, would be most of the staffing industry. When people think about temp workers, it's usually people that are in retail positions or in warehouses carrying boxes or shipping delivery trucks and these kinds of things. We don't do any of that work. We really focus on knowledge work. But to your point, I mean, some knowledge work is paid hundreds, if not thousands of dollars an hour, and other knowledge work can be much closer to minimum wage.
And you do the whole range?
We do the whole range.
Tell us, you jumped right into kind of what you do, but tell us a little bit of the story, because what I think people are trying to wrap their heads around on the roots of this phenomena, And I do know there were previous companies, and there's been kind of a rolling story. Without getting into too much of the detail, but just give us a sense of the roots of how you got
so I think there used to be two separate companies, and the story that's probably the easiest to explain was a company called Odesk, which started in 2004. And it's a very personal story, like many of these Silicon Valley-based startups. Two Greek engineers, one who lives in Palo Alto, the other one lives in Athens in Greece. And they want to work together, they're college friends, and they both want to work at Silicon Valley-based tech companies. And so they get all excited, they start interviewing for roles at various tech companies, and systematically, the one who's based in Silicon Valley gets the job, the one who's based in Athens never gets an offer. And after a while, they're like, what's going on here? We're both equally qualified. Why on earth is one getting the job and the other one isn't? And systematically, what would come back was the employer would say, we love both of you, but frankly, one of you is remote, and we just don't see how you can possibly be a remote engineer and be successful. And you have to go back, this is 12, 13 years ago. Back in the days, it was fairly controversial, this idea that knowledge work could be done from anywhere, even though conceptually, I think everybody gets the fact that this 9-to-5 on-site W2 is a remnant of the first industrial revolution. It really doesn't make any sense in the 21st century. People get it conceptually, but at least back 10, 12 years ago, they didn't want to put it in practice. And so what these two founders decided to do was to say, well, if nobody's going to hire us, then we're just going to hire ourselves and we're going to start a company. And the logical product to build was a product to help companies manage a remote workforce. And that's how Odesk got started. From there, they started building a marketplace, realizing that doing a very hands-on approach where one founder would go talk to every tech company to offer them remote software engineers, and the other one would be driving throughout Europe to find talented software engineers to work for Silicon Valley-based company. That was not going to be scalable. So they started building this platform to help connect the businesses, initially early-stage startups in Silicon Valley with freelancers initially in Europe, and allow them to essentially have the equivalent of a full-time job, but as an independent worker and in a remote location. And fast forward to today, we've essentially moved towards completely a marketplace model where people can come to our site on both sides of the network, either as buyers of services, companies, or as providers of services, freelancers, independent workers. People can sign up, connect with each other, and then we manage all of the, I would say, administrative burden of giving you leads, because most freelancers don't really enjoy looking for new clients, and in particularly in categories like design and engineering, people tend to be somewhat introverted and really not enjoy the whole marketing part of it. So we deliver leads to you, and we also automate the other part of freelancing, which people usually don't enjoy, is all of the administrative stuff. Like getting paid, making sure that you can reconcile your invoices with the payments, giving files to your accountant so that you can know what's a personal expense versus what's a business expense, and then ultimately helping with things like compliance and worker classification and all of that stuff. So if you had to summarize the life of a freelancer, there's three pieces to the life of a freelancer, right? One is getting new business, which could be from existing clients or new clients, but it's all about business development. Second one is actually doing the work. And that's usually what you enjoy doing. That's why you signed up to be a freelancer in the first place. And it's also where you get paid, right? This is the billable work that you do. And then the third piece is administration work. It's collection, it's invoicing, it's taxes, reporting, accounting, all of that stuff. And generally speaking, most freelancers really enjoy the middle part, and most of them don't enjoy the other two. And that's what the technology is trying to build, right? Automate number one and number three so that people can focus all of their time and their energy on the things that they really want to do.
So 2004, very early, one of the first, if not the first company, would you say, in this space?
So the other company that we merged with was a company called Elance, which started in 1999. So there was even earlier attempt at this.
That was based here, if I recall.
And it was also based here. And the name Elance came from a research paper, I think from MIT, where one of the professors said, look, freelancing is on the rise, but the next ways of freelancing is e-lancing. And that's how Elance got started as a company. And the idea at the time, which is still very much true today, freelancers in the US earn about $1 trillion a year. Right? Upwork is only $1 billion a year, so 0.1% market share of this. And fundamentally, there's a huge inefficiency in the system. The way freelancers find jobs is through personal networks and through, frankly, spending an inordinate amount of time on work that is neither enjoyable nor billable, so very inefficient on the freelancer side, and equally inefficient on the business side. If you're a small business and you're looking for a part-time accountant or an outside counsel or a designer to help you build your marketing collateral, you don't know where to find them. And so you've got both a big part of the economy, right? $1 trillion is not an insignificant part of the US economy, but a part of the economy that is extremely inefficient both for the buyer and for the service provider. And so that research paper about freelancing was really about saying freelancing is growing and it's here to stay. It's inefficient the way it's done right now. People will build platforms to make it more effective for both parties to meet each other, and that's how freelance got started.
Fascinating. Now, when you use, just to be clear on the language, do you use the word freelancer or contract worker or independent worker, or do you different, or temp workers? I mean, there's all kinds of different language here. What's the how do you talk about it?
We talk about it as freelancers. There's any number of names. Some of them have a legal connotation to them. For instance, an independent contractor or a temp worker is associated with a type of contract. Some freelancers will have a W-2 from time to time. Some of them will have a 1099 from time to time. That's also a very US-specific language. It's different in the UK and it's different in continental Europe, as an example. The generic term seems to be independent professional, but that is a little bit of a mouthful. Like if you have to say this, 100 times a day, it gets a little bit old. And it's also not that inspiring. And a lot of people find the word freelancing to be, fairly liberating. It's something fairly aspirational. It has the word free in it. And people like freedom. It's all about freedom and flexibility. And this notion of freelancing resonates extremely well with all three generations of the workforce. Quite often people associate freelancing with millennials. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's true, millennials are much more likely to be freelancers than my generation, Generation X, or the baby boomers. But the reality is all three generations of the workforce are being represented in freelancing for very different reasons. So the millennials are all about freedom. I want to be my own boss. I don't believe that corporations, and in particular large corporations, are acting in my best interest. I think they're acting in the best interest of their shareholders. And so I'm really on my own. Generation X is all about flexibility. Elderly parents, young children, spouse mobility, all sorts of reasons why the traditional 9-to-5 W-2 type of job is just too inflexible for the types of compromises you have to make with your personal life. And the baby boomers, increasingly are retiring, and they're realizing either that their dream life of golfing all day long gets really boring after 6 months, or they just realize their bank account does not allow them. We retire when we are 60 to 65, but now our life expectancy is 85 years old. So you've got to have saved enough money to be able to live well for the next 20 years of your life. A lot of people just don't have that type of luxury. And so as a result, you really see it in all three generations in the workforce.
So the boomer one being more of a supplementary thing, right?
So what we see a lot from the boomers is they don't want to go back to a full-time job. They've retired. They really do not want the idea of having a boss again. In many countries, it's really even hard for them to get a boss again. Like in Europe, once you've retired, most employers will say things like, you're too old to work here, right? So it's actually hard to get a real normal job. Whereas conversely, you typically have an incredible amount of wisdom, an incredible amount of skills that you've accumulated over decades of work. And most companies actually want to rehire you as a consultant. They really want you to come and provide that wisdom to the younger workers, train people in the company, or just come in for very specific projects where you have the skills that nobody else has anymore, and you can bring in that talent to work. And so it's kind of a win-win where as the retiree, it gives you more flexibility than you had before and gives you the extra income. And at the same time, for the company, it gives them access to skills that they don't necessarily have in-house anymore.
So a lot of your observations about how the freelancers think about themselves comes from your interaction with, what did you say, 15 million of these over time here? Or are you talking about this from general kind of observations of just the whole field? Or is it just, are you polling? Are you figuring out, are you getting these insights from actually the very many people you're working with here?
So I would say both.
Okay.
Obviously, we have a ton of interactions and a lot of data from our own users. We spend a big amount of time. I mean, we see ourselves as the agents of the freelancers. If you had to ask me what do I do for a living, I help freelancers be successful, right? So we obviously need to get a lot of insights on what it takes to help them be successful. Beyond that, we actually do studies regularly. Probably the one that is the best known is a study that we do annually called Freelancing in America, which is trying to replicate the data that the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, uses for the normal job reports, because they don't really represent freelancers all that well. And we try to take the same methodology, the same sample, and ask questions specifically about freelancing. And the key findings every year that people write a lot about are probably number one, the fact that the freelancing population is much larger than what most people think. It's over a third of the US workers are doing some amount of freelancing every year. An increasing number of those are actually full-time, meaning that's their sole source of income is a freelancing activity. It's not in addition to something else. It's not moonlighting and being a student during the day. It's truly being a full-time freelancer.
Do you know what percentage that is, or what?
I think last year was about 25% of that total. And
of the third. So
yeah,
of the third,
of the
there's
33
a 25.
or 35% was last year. I think about 25 was full-time. And as I said, they earn $1 trillion a year, right? So that's about 10% of the U.S. economy. It's a fairly substantial amount of money. The other thing that I think people tend to underestimate is how happy the freelancers are. There's a little bit of a historical misconception of freelancers are like temp workers and staffing firms are not, don't typically make people happy. I mean, the NPS of staffing firms tend to be negative. And yet today, the freelancers are mostly doing this by choice. So 2/3 of the freelancers, the people that declare that they do freelancing say that they do it by choice. They are on just about every metric happier than the similar people in the survey that are employees. And 50% of them say that no amount of money could convince them to go back to a traditional full-time job, right? And that is partly because people change their lives around freelancing. When you are a full-time employee, your work life and your personal life are dictated by your work life. You're going to be living in this city because you need to be close to the office, and from 9 to 5 and potentially later than that, you need to be in the office. And that's just not negotiable. So you'll manage your life around your work schedule. As a freelancer, you do the opposite. You manage your work schedule around your personal life. And that has an insane value to most people, at least to the people that become freelancers. And that's why when they say there's no amount of money that you could pay me to go back to a full-time job, they're not just joking about it. They're very serious because they moved outside. They no longer live in New York and San Francisco, and they don't want to live here. The cost of living is crazy. Congestion is crazy. They're just done with that life. And then the idea that they always have to make compromises where work comes first and personal life, your children, your parents, your community comes second is no longer something that they're willing to do. So they're willing to compromise on many things, just not on that.
So when you say 25% of the freelancers are working full-time, is that 25% of the third, or is that?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's two. So
and it's
overall,
growing. It's growing. I mean, like every year when we ask the question, the number of hours that they work per week being freelancers keeps on increasing. And I think a lot of this is driven by the fact that there's another bigger population, which we also ask in that survey, who are people that are employees but want to make the switch to freelancing. And what happens every year is you've got, and basically the flux is only going in one direction. There's more and more people that switch from being full-time employee to being freelancers, and almost no one switches from being freelancer to being an employee. And so that's feeding that pool. And then you add to that the generation mix. The boomers historically have been less freelancing than the millennials, and the millennials are quickly becoming the biggest generation in the workforce. So almost mathematically, the number of freelancers and the amount of money earned through freelancing will continue to increase.
And this is the universe you're talking about are more the professional freelancers,
No,
right?
this is U.S. workers across all categories.
So even like a house cleaner who's a freelancer.
Everybody who declares themselves as a freelancer. One of the challenges with all of the research on this, including the government data, is how do you define freelancing?
Exactly.
And the government tends to look at it based on the tax form. If you're 1099, you're freelancer. If you're W-2, you're employee. And the reality is that's just the legal framework. It is what it is. Some freelancers have to be W-2'd from time to time, and some people that would probably consider themselves employees are misclassified as being 1099s. That is not the way you should be asking the question. Really, you should be asking people like, do you see yourself mostly as a freelancer, mostly as an employee, or a hybrid between the two? And having that level of classification is not something that the government provides. And that's why you see Intuit has a study, we have a study, McKinsey did one, the McKinsey Global Institute did one a couple of years ago, and they're all trying to get to the same different view on this, which is asking the workers themselves how they see their activity, as opposed to looking at a payrolling provider or looking at a set of taxes that are being filed to try to then reverse engineer what might be in people's brains.
Got you. Yeah. But how much of Upworks kind of the people who work in Upwork are outside the United States?
So it's a very global platform, right? I mean, there's people signing up on both sides of the network in 180 countries. And so it depends on the category, it depends on everything. But you've got, if you look at, for instance, one of the stats we used to publish a long time ago, and we haven't renewed it, but it used to be that the US freelancers in the smaller cities were getting more work from outside of the US than they were getting from the US, as an example, right? And I'm not sure I can explain why, other than, if let's say you're a Chinese company and you're trying to understand the US market, we tend to struggle to understand the Chinese market, but the Chinese also struggle to understand our market. So they go hire local people in parts of America where they're trying to launch their products to help them understand, what the local market looks like. And so there's a lot of these. I mean, a lot of the business is domestic because, frankly, work tends to be more domestic. It's easier to hire a freelancer in your time zone, using the same legal framework that you're using. They share the same culture, they share the same language. So it's easier for a German company to hire a German freelancer. But in some cases, you need the global aspect of this. If you're a business in the US and you're trying to understand German law as it relates to, some part of your business, it's quite likely that the best freelancer you're going to find is in Germany. Or if you're trying to do translation, as an example, I'm sure you can find Korean and Japanese translators in the US, but a lot of them are going to be in Japan and Korea.
Fascinating. And so you're, not only is the technological changes driving it, but the globalization phenomenon is also driving.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the next generation after globalization, right? I mean, if you think about the evolution of the labor market, we used to have, way back in the day, we had the cottage industry. And the cottage industry was fundamentally freelancing, right? But then comes the first industrial revolution, and that's when the W-2 came about. That's when we decided let's all be in the same place at the same time, fixed labor contract, providing some amount of benefits on top of it. And that made sense at the time. And then you fast forward to the 50s when the staffing industry started. And the idea of the staffing industry was saying, look, this whole idea that everybody should be long-term employed by a single company doesn't make a ton of sense when change seems to be accelerating. And that was like 60 years ago. Change has only kept on accelerating, right? Mm-hmm. And then you move to the 80s where people started realizing a lot of this work is global. Companies should focus on what's core to them and outsource what's not core to them. And in a world that is more global, you might as well outsource to India, China, whatever, right? And that was the whole outsourcing industry. And I think you fast forward to today and you realize, that thing has had its limits, both because of political issues as well as because the cost of living has risen a lot in these countries, as well as the fact that in many cases automation is actually reducing the value of an arbitrage in human labor, as an example. And so the premium now is much more on flexibility and it's much more on having the right skills at the right time. The whole on-demand economy comes from this idea that you never have the resources that you need exactly at the right time if you have an inflexible system to deliver the resources. If you can have a flexible system, then as a company you can be more successful because you can hire exactly the right talents just when you need them. And as a worker, you end up making more money because you're being paid for everything that you deliver as opposed to being discounted by a traditional employer because most of the time they don't really need your skills. So it's really a win-win that comes from the increase in flexibility, but it only works if you can make the transactions happen at minimum cost. If it takes a lot of time for the company to find the freelancers and takes a lot of time for the freelancers to find the right companies, then a lot of that transaction cost makes it less compelling to do freelancing and more compelling to do traditional employment.
Got you. Now, so we've kind of been probing what does the freelancer, the worker want, and you touched on it here, but I just want to bring it out so that from the point of view of the employer or the company or however you want to think about the organization, why do they love this so much? I mean, you started to talk about it there, but I just want to get it from what you're understanding from your 5 million people. What are they telling you? Just like the freelancers are telling you.
So I'll tell you the positive and then I'll tell you the negative. I mean, what they're looking for fundamentally is access to talent that they don't have internally, right? Either because they don't need it full time or because they can't attract the talent. Mm-hmm. And what happens is essentially what's happened to the movie industry, right? So if you think about Hollywood pre-World War II, movie studios tended to be fairly large employers. The carpenter that built the movie set would be an employee, and the costume designer and the makeup artist and the special effects people and a gazillion other types of jobs were fully employed by the movie studio. And if you fast forward to today, they tend to be very thin companies in terms of number of employees. And all of these jobs are done by freelancers. And the reason is because the jobs have become more specialized. So it used to be that you could be the special effects person that knew everything about special effects. Well, I don't know much about special effects, but from what I understand, there are thousands of different jobs within that now. And so as a movie company now, you can't afford to have as full-time employee every single type of special effects people when you only need them 1% of the time. Mm-hmm. So it makes more sense for the employer in that case to only hire the talent when you need it at a specific time in the production of that specific movie and let that worker work on other projects in the meantime. So that's the idea for the companies. You either can't attract the talent because you work in a place that is overly competitive, like Silicon Valley, where most companies struggle to find engineers, or the opposite, you work in a place where there's not enough talent, like a big part of the Midwest, where companies, tech companies want to hire workers, but they really struggle to find them. So that's one reason. And the second reason is because you just don't need that person full time. You just have something that is so specialized that you don't need them full time. And the reason why now is because skills are becoming more obsolete faster than they ever have before. There's some research right now that says that the half-life of a skill is about 5 years, meaning what you know today is half as valuable in 5 years and then half as valuable again 5 years later. That forces companies to retrain their workers at a pace that they frankly are not equipped to do well. And it's much more efficient if you let the workers figure out where the world is going and retrain themselves. Right? So that's on the company side, and I would say that that's the positive side of this. The tough part of it is the workers are much more ready for that change than companies are. And if you look at a marketplace like Upwork as an example, we're much more constrained by the number of jobs on the platform than we are constrained by the number of freelancers. There's over 10,000 people signing up on Upwork every day. 98% of them...
New people?
Yeah, every day. Right? 98% of them will never get a job. And it's not because they're not qualified. Of course, some people are just not qualified, but it's not generally because they're not qualified, and it's not because we are some kind of evil company that keeps people out. It's because we don't have enough jobs for people. Right? And so the reality is the demand, the desire for freelancing on the worker side is huge, and it's spreading like wildfire. It's incredibly viral. People want to have freedom. They want to have flexibility. Not everybody wants to move to London, Shanghai, New York, San Francisco. People want to be close to their families and their communities, and they want to have the flexibility of working on what they want to work on. The real change that needs to happen now is on the business side. Companies need to rethink themselves, reinvent themselves, and realize that the future is more flexible, the future is more hybrid than the past. And a lot of companies, especially the bigger organizations, are finally moving there, but I would say it's been years in the making. And so today, 20% of the Fortune 500 companies are using Upwork, but they're still using it in a very small percentage if you compare it to how they work with staffing firms or how they work with traditional outsourcing companies, your IT services company and your law firm and your accounting firm and your consulting firm. They still spend orders of magnitude more through these traditional ways of doing things than they do through freelancing. It is changing though. It's really finally picking up. And I think part of it is at some point, supply needs to meet demand. What we hear a lot from big corporations is, I struggle to hire millennials. How can you help me? And usually the way we help is to say, you can't hire millennials. They just don't want to work for you. They're not going to be your W-2. If you want to work with millennials, and you have to, you have an aging workforce, you need to bring in fresh talent. They're not going to work for you as an employer-employee relationship. They're going to work with you as a client-freelancer relationship. And if you're willing to make that change happen, then we can definitely help you.
That's fascinating. I had no idea that it was that. That's a choke point that could be improved. So one of the things we're trying to do is how do you build the systems going forward? Like how do you improve the whole system?
Yeah.
And so we've seen it, what your platform's doing to get to this place. But I'm interested in these insights you have into both key constituencies here.
Yeah.
And there's a third constituency, let's just say government, public
Sure.
policy kind of things.
Yeah.
So when you see in a system evolving, let's just think about what you see as the things that would greatly improve the situation in the next 5 to 10 years, even,
Sure.
but even the shorter 5 years
Yeah.
or something. So when you look at it from the worker point of view, talk about the things that you're seeing emerging from them or what they need. We've been talking to other people about this too, but I'm curious what you see.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, first of all, I think we need to realize this thing is coming from an increase in pace of change. Like, technology is exponential. Skills will continue to evolve faster and faster. Mm-hmm. So the situation that we see today will continue. It's not some kind of fad where millennials are, whatever attribute you want to put behind them, but they're, hard to work with, and they'll grow up and they'll get married and they'll have children and they'll settle down and we can go back to the old world. The old world is not coming back, right? The future is much more independent than the past. So we need to take that for granted and then figure out, so what does it mean for us as corporation, us as government, us as the public education system, and us as workers, because that is the future and it's here to stay. Specifically on workers, what it means is, it means that you are an entrepreneur. No longer do you start working when you're 16 or 18 or 20 at the bottom of the food chain in a big corporation, and you'll go up through the ranks throughout your life, and you'll retire and you'll get a pension that is paid for by that employer. That is a thing of the past, mm-hmm. right? The number of years you're going to stay at the same company, whether as a freelancer or as an employee, is a couple of years. So you'll have 10, 15, 20 careers throughout your life, and you need to plan for this properly. And that's, to me, that is entrepreneurship, right? What is the product that you sell? It's your brain. And the question is, how do you build a roadmap for your brain? What is your brain today? What are you selling today? How do you differentiate? How do you position yourself? How do you price yourself effectively so that you can have the most successful career today? But then the roadmap is, what about the future? So at what point do you need to switch from doing the same thing again, yet another project as a freelancer, yet another similar job as an employee, to the next phase in your career? And it's really about understanding where the demand is going. You should train yourself on skills that are about to get hot. If you're too early, then you're going to train yourself on something that may never become in demand. If you're too late, then you're joining the crowded pack of everybody else that knows those skills. So ideally, you figure out where the world is going just, a few months or a few years ahead of everybody. You train yourself on it. And more, there's online resources. You don't necessarily need to go back to university, but this topic of lifelong learning is absolutely essential for the future. And I would say our education system is extremely poorly designed for that. So you have to position yourself for today, figure out where the world is going next, train yourself for that next set of skills, and then do the same thing again. And it's rinse and repeat. You're going to do that every 2 to 3 years for the rest of your life. And people need to build that mentality. And that's probably one of the biggest failings of our education system today, is not setting the right expectation that, yes, you can go to college and that's great. And maybe you'll even go to grad school and that's even better. But in practice, whatever you've learned is going to be completely relevant within the next 10 years. And you need to have set the expectation with young people from an early age that it is all about continuous learning. It's all about curiosity. It's all about the learnability, this ability and this desire to learn throughout your life, and not think that when you're 22 years old, you've learned everything that you would ever need to learn and you can just, milk those skills for the rest of your life, because that sets you up for, disaster, frankly, within the next 5 to 10 years.
So you're kind of giving them advice, which I think is good, but I'm also just saying, is like, what do they need?
Yeah.
From a system point of view. So for example, the training, better education opportunities, more flexible training. Yeah. Just a few more of those ideas. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, what do we need to rough out here to really make it work?
So there's a whole ecosystem, right? And in particular, I think when you only talk to employees, you take a lot of things for granted. And it's only when you start working with freelancers that you realize the world is not adapted to freelancers. So let me give you an example. In the US specifically, your FICO score, your credit score, one of the key determinants of it is what is your W-2. Right? Now, you can be a freelancer and have received a 1099 with hundreds of thousands or potentially even millions of dollars on it. Because you don't have a W-2, your credit score is going to be a lot lower. So basic things like getting a credit card, getting a mortgage, getting a loan to get a car, all of these things are easier if you're a W-2 than if you're a 1099. Now, historically, hasn't been a big issue. There were not that many freelancers. The few that existed were mostly full-time employees with a little bit of freelancing. And then of the ones that were mostly freelancers, maybe they had a spouse that was an employee. So historically, not that big of a deal. But moving forward, there's an increasing number of people that are just not well covered by the financial system today. And I think that's an opportunity for the private sector. You know, if you're a bank or mortgage lender, you should look at this and say, maybe I need to build new risk models to go after this independent worker population. It's also an opportunity for the public sector. You know, maybe we need to change the regulation system to say you can't discriminate against 1099, because that's essentially what the systems are doing today. Right? So that's an example. The one that people talk about a lot is the healthcare system, right? I mean, the US system progressively got designed to bundle the idea of a job with the idea of healthcare. There's no particular reason for it. You know, it's frankly just as evil as when your telco is bundling your cell phone with it just to like lock you in forever, right? I mean, the notion of benefits should be the same whether you work for a large corporation or you work for a small corporation or you work as an independent. And so this is not directly tied to freelancing. If you're a startup and you have 10 employees and you go to the big healthcare providers and you say, give us a good deal, you don't get the same good deal than if you're a Fortune 500 company asking for the same. That is, you know, not, that is a type of market failure fundamentally. There's no reason tied to the risk, the health risk of the population. It's purely bargaining power because you're an independent or a small business and you just don't have the level of net leverage with the big healthcare providers compared to if you're a Fortune 500 company. So all of these things can be fixed through a combination of the private sector identifying an opportunity, like in this case, healthcare providers realizing, hey, there's 55 million Americans that are freelancing, and if I created an affordable healthcare benefits product that was targeting that population, I would be getting a big share of it because I have first mover advantage. It can be also an opportunity for the public sector to say, hey, we need to change the regulatory system so that there is an ability for freelancers to be successful. But I think fundamentally it's realizing that helping freelancers being successful is a good thing for the US economy. It is the path forward. You know, in a world where change is the new norm, flexibility has to come with change. You can't be rigid and change. It's completely opposite. So you need flexibility in the workforce, and so you need to make sure that the flexible workforce can be as successful as possible. And if the private sector figures it out, great. If the private sector doesn't figure it out, then the public sector should get in there. Now, what's really, really important for the regulators to think about is how do you do that without messing things up? You know, like the huge issue you have in this workforce is it's 55 million people, so they're not all the same. There's people that are making a lot of money and people that are in entry-level positions. There are people that do this for a living and other people for whom it's additional income. There are people that get benefits from their spouse and really don't want a platform, as an example, to withdraw part of their earnings. And so you need to do this in a way that doesn't improve it for a small percentage of people and hurt everybody else. One question, for instance, we ask in our Freelancing in America study every time is, would you rather pay for your own benefits, or would you rather have the platform or whoever is helping you find jobs withdraw part of your income to pay for your own benefits? And every single time, 2/3 of people say, no, give me the money, and I'll pay for my own benefits, despite the fact that when they pay for their own benefits, they may have to pay more than if it was a pooled benefit that was negotiated in bulk from by the platform itself, right? And so,
what do you make of that? Why?
Well, people like when they
don't trust it. They don't trust.
No, but I think like the whole concept, like if you want to be a freelancer or you want to be independent, you want to be independent. Like the whole point is you're not trying to be dependent. You're not trying to go back to another form of doing the same where you're locked in by the big corporation who basically pays for a bunch of things for you, except that they really are in it for themselves. They're not in it for you, right? So when people start to have this level of desire for independence and desire for controlling their own lives, they don't want to go back to a system where you withdraw a bunch of things and you choose for me and you limit my options.
True, but is it also true, because we're getting this from other people in these interviews and in the programming we've done and stuff, that there is a real worry about insecurity, safety nets, and things that they don't want to be so independent that it's just them alone against the world. Would you go that far? I'm just curious how you hear that.
So actually what we hear a lot is of the non-freelancers. So, there's been a lot of studies that say that employees are actually pretty unhappy in America, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a little bit of a romantic view that, oh my God, W2 is so awesome and being a freelancer is so scary. Actually, like most employees hate their jobs, right? So when you ask them, like, would you be interested in switching to freelancing? You usually get a huge number of people that say, absolutely, I actually want to look into this within the next 2 to 3 years. But then when you ask them, like, are you likely to do it or not? Usually the number one reason that comes out for, no, I probably won't do it is, I'm scared that I'm not going to be able to make enough money to justify the new flexibility that I have in my life. And so that is one place where both the public and the private sector can help, right? Again, to the extent that flexibility is a good thing for the economy, it's better at the end of the day for the workers, they're happier, and it's better for the company because they can access the skills that they need. Facilitating that transition from these people that actually want to become freelancers, making sure that they can make the jump and do it in a way that is safe is probably fairly critical. And part of it is perceptions, this fear of I may not have enough work to keep myself busy. Like how do you facilitate that transition so that people can get the reassurance that they need? That's the perception part, but part of it may be reality. And if it's true that a freelancer who is a first-time freelancer or it's their first 5-6 months or year or whatever, if it's true that they're more likely to have dry spells and it's more likely that they're going to be having periods where they do well and periods where they don't do well, then let's figure out insurance products. Whether they're privately funded or publicly funded, like how do we find products that can make people feel safe doing this, fully knowing that the destination is the right destination. Like people will be more successful, they will make more money, companies will get more flexibility, and in a world where change is accelerating, we need to get ahead of it. We're way behind it right now.
Fascinating, the whole insurance product thing. I hadn't really thought about that, but that's an interesting one. Yeah, because through this, we're always trying to figure out what could be solved by the private sector, what could be solved by the public, where, who needs what together. So just given our time, we got to kind of keep moving here a little bit, but I'm interested in, from the point of view of the employers, because we've been kind of thinking it from the freelancers, but where do they see things that would help the system work better? In the same way, from the private sector, public sector, however you think about it, but what's the pain points? What are the things that they're trying to figure out?
Well, I think small businesses have figured it out, right? I mean, traditionally, both the overall freelancing economy and Upwork operate with small businesses, right? The big corporations traditionally have worked with large outsourcing type of companies, right? They've worked with IBM and Accenture and McKinsey and what have you, right? And so the thing that needs to change now is not so much the small businesses who, it's part of their DNA, they get it, it's fine. It's corporate America, it's the Fortune 500 and below. And, it's a big change for people, right? This idea that you're going to have people that don't necessarily come to your office and they will control, or they'll have access to intellectual property of your company. And, you might not be able to tell your shareholders that you control these people because you don't. They're freelancers. That's the whole point. You don't control them. So there's a lot of change in mentality that needs to happen. I think, in conversations that we have with CEOs and CXOs of the Fortune 500, they completely get it intellectually. Like people get the fact that, look, the best workers in the world don't all work for me right now. And by the way, they don't all work within a 25-mile radius of where I'm located. And my number one issue right now in being successful is to fill the recs that I have with the most talented people. So intellectually, like people completely get it, they're on board. The problem is when reality kicks in 4 or 5 levels down in the organization and people have been operating in a certain way for 20 years. And now they're being asked to do something differently, and in particular, the old way that most big corporations are organized is very different from the movie industry. The movie industry was always a project-based industry, right? Like you start a movie, you finish the movie, you launch the movie, you move to the next one. most organizations in corporate America today are still organized by the traditional org charts. Different business units, different divisions, different departments. Information goes up and down for approvals. It doesn't go across all that well. And so one of the enablers of this is when companies move from traditional organization charts to team-based work, project-based organizations. And frankly, one of the reasons why we've had so much success with professional services organizations or with consumer packaged goods companies, as an example, or with tech companies themselves, is because they are more likely to be project and team-based than they are likely to be, divisional, traditional-based. I think what's happening in corporate America, though, is more and more pressure on being more agile, being more successful at product launches, being closer to the customer. All of these things are forcing these organizations to rethink how they organize anyway. And as they move towards more, team, project, agile-based organizations, the concept of augmenting your workforce with freelancers makes a lot more sense.
You mentioned in the beginning, in terms of getting over that mentality, you mentioned something in the beginning that I want to get back to, and this is a good time to bring it back, which is the origins of your company, where this idea of surely you can't do the same quality work virtually or from afar that you can physically. So talk to me about that, honestly about it, because I think it's a complex thing, because there is something about we're in the same room together here. We could have done it over the phone. Anyhow, so I'm just curious, what do you know, how do you talk about that, about what's just as good, what's better, and what honestly is not as good working from afar?
So I would say there's perception and reality. Right? Okay. So here's the perception. The perception is, if I ask any manager in America, do you manage by FaceTime or do you manage by objectives? Everybody would say, oh, no, I don't manage by FaceTime because I'm a well-trained manager. Of course I manage by objectives. And you're like, okay, so if you don't see the person, do you think they can be working and being successful? And you'd be like, well, if I don't see them, how do I know that they're working? And you're like, well, didn't we just agree that you're not managing by FaceTime, right? So there's that perception of, I pretend that I'm not managing by FaceTime, but boy, do I feel more comfortable if I can see that the person is working than if I don't, right? And so that's the perception side of it. And part of it goes through just reassuring people. Another study we do every year is on the buyer side of the network. So talking to companies about how they use freelancers. And what we find a lot is initial perception that it's not going to work. And then once they've started using it, realizing that that perception is actually not accurate. Right? So that's the perception. I think the reality is twofold. One is the same person who's working in your office can be more or less productive than the same person when they're remote, depending on the type of activity. And specifically, when it's highly about figuring things out, brainstorming, ideation, strategic thinking, really thinking about the big picture, the face-to-face time in front of a whiteboard with a lot of Post-it notes still beats the remote collaboration. Not as much as it used to. We've really improved a lot of these virtual collaboration technologies. Everybody can do video conferencing these days. There's a lot more ways that people can interact virtually, but still putting people in the same room for highly collaborative type of work does help. Where it doesn't help, and it's actually typically very counterproductive, is when it comes to execution. And you hear that a lot from employees, right? People get distracted in an office, and particularly if you're in an open space, which is the new thing and it's cool, the amount of noise and the amount of interruption that you get is very high. And a lot of knowledge work, has initial parts where you need to collaborate a lot, but then has a lot of parts where you need to do things. You need to write that research paper. You need to write the code. You need to, come up with the next design for the next product or what have you. And every time you get interrupted, it takes you quite some time to get back in the flow. And so people are actually much more successful during that part of a project when they can be isolated. And when you work from home or you work from a different place than the rest of your coworkers, you're actually much more productive. And on average, there's been various studies, one recently by Stanford, that shows that office workers are actually more productive when they work from home than when they work from an office, right? So that's the reality. I think the other question is, where is it going? How much is it changing over time? And I think what you find is that with each iteration of technology tools, things get better, and so the reality gets more and more on the positive side. When we started this company, and I wasn't even there at the time, but when they started the company, broadband was not as ubiquitous as it is today. Video conferencing, you didn't have a laptop or an iPhone or an Android phone that had a video camera on it. These things you could buy, they were pretty expensive. Most people didn't have one. And so you were mostly going to do things over email, but attachment size were limited, landlines, but they were really expensive. Fast forward to today, it's obviously much better. Your tools are in the cloud, video conferencing is ubiquitous and free. But you start looking at the next generation of tools where you see things like augmented reality and virtual reality. Microsoft and Google both have like amazing prototypes of what this is going to look like in the future. And you can see a world where even if people are sitting next to each other, the way they'll engage with each other is going to be through some kind of technology interface, which will mean that whether they're close to each other or they're not becomes quite irrelevant. And I would say, maybe a preview of this is when you look at young people in an office, they might be sitting 10 feet from each other and they're still chatting. Like rather than go and stand up and talk, they have their headphones, they're listening to their music and they're chatting with each other because that mode of communication works better for them. So if you're 10 feet away or 1,000 miles away, it doesn't really matter anymore. Now, the one thing that I don't know how we're going to fix, and maybe we'll never fix it, is time zones.
Yeah.
And one thing that's interesting about the world today is it's still very much organized by latitude when it should really be organized by longitude. Like we tend to work with people in Europe and work with people in Asia who have totally different time zones, and that's problematic. And we don't work as much with people in Latin America, as an example, who have much more compatibility in time zones. And there is, a potential where Europe works more with Africa than they do today, and North America works more with South America than they do today, because the technology will not fix the time zone issue.
It's fascinating. Actually, we're doing a project, or just starting a project on virtual reality, and it's interesting to just think it's not that far here.
Yeah, I think
to where you're going to see a very immersive.
Yeah, people tend to think about reality, VR and AR as gaming and entertainment mechanisms, and I'm sure that's great too. But if you think about the impact on collaboration in the office, it's going to be massive. And right now, it's just not ready. Like you can't see yourself wearing a HoloLens for 8 hours a day. I mean, you'd probably get a huge headache, well before that. So it's clearly not there. But these types of technologies tend to go, step functions. They stagnate for a couple of years, and then the next wave comes about, and they become that much better. And there will be a point where it's so good that people use these things every day.
Completely agree with that. Okay, well, we're getting to the point here.
And by the way, it's a good thing. The other thing that I think we should, mention is this is a good thing for society, right? I mean, this whole notion that 50% of the world's GDP is happening in a couple hundred cities in the world, and then the vast majority of the population, including the college-educated population, either doesn't live there either because they don't want to or because they can't live there. And so this idea that if you live in San Francisco, you have more economic opportunities than if you live, a couple hundred miles away from here. That is just not a good thing for the economy. It's not a good thing for society. It's led to some of the political events we've seen in the US and in Europe. A world where you allow people to, work remotely it's a world that is more fair. And fundamentally, the good idea of the first industrial revolution was this idea that when you move the worker to where the work is, away from the farm and towards the assembly line, you were creating value for society. That was true, but it's not true anymore. Now we need to do the opposite. We need to allow the work to go to where the worker is, as opposed to trying to keep pushing more and more people in impact cities. If you're a young person today in the US, there's a little bit of a catch-22. You either stay in your hometown in the middle of the country, where cost of living is low, and you may have a good quality of life, but economic opportunity may be very limited, or you move to San Francisco, where there's a lot of economic opportunities, but cost of living is outrageous. The cost of rent in San Francisco goes up by 7% per year. It's been going up for 40 years that way. And so you're either, struggling because of lack of economic opportunities or struggling because of high cost of life. That is not a healthy outcome for the economy.
Completely agree. Well, we're getting to the end here. So I remember reading an article that you wrote, or that was at a Fast Company, that you were talking about trends that were coming together, but also you used, at least the story used this idea of the next 5 years to 2021, and that a lot of what's happening now is, like you said, not going to stop.
Yeah.
But that, so I'm kind of interested in just your thoughts from your vantage point of what do you think is going to happen here in the next 5 years, and What are some of those things that you think are what's going on in that next 5 years?
Yeah.
That I was curious what you think.
I mean, I think there's what's happening and what's not happening.
Oh, okay.
Because there's a lot of,
exactly.
I think what's happening is a continuation of what we see today, which is more corporations, and in particular more large corporations, building these hybrid teams of local versus remote and employee versus freelancers. I mean, that's a trend. It's here to stay, partly because the companies need it, but frankly, mostly partly because the workers want it. And ultimately, companies need to adapt. We're in the talent economy. If you can only find the talent in a certain way, then you have to adapt or you die. Right? So I think that's not going to change over the next 5 years. I don't think I'm making a crazily bold prediction here. I think the numbers all support it. The stuff that is taking a lot of the media right now, which is not going to happen in the next 5 years, is AI and robots taking away our jobs. Now, is it going to happen over the next 200 or 300 years? Probably, right? Realistically, as far as we know, there's nothing magical about our brains. There's nothing that is, impossible to understand. It is purely chemistry and physics, and eventually we'll figure out how the brain works, and we'll have computers that are powerful enough that they can emulate the brain. And when that happens, and the machines are just as smart as we are, but the marginal cost of producing a new machine is zero, then there's going to be a big question for, what do we do as human beings? It's not happening anytime soon, right? I mean, if you look at it today, if anything, I would say we have a scarcity of human. We don't have a scarcity of machine. People are obsessed with this idea that, automation is going to drive huge amounts of unemployment, and we're not going to know what to do with all these human beings. And the reality is the opposite. If I remember when I was a kid, if you wanted to program a mainframe computer, the thing was so expensive that you would probably write the program on a piece of paper first, and then get your colleagues to debug it for you. Mm-hmm. Because once you put it in the machine, it had better work because the machine was insanely expensive. Yeah. Machines are free today, right? So they are not the bottleneck. They are not the limiting factor in our economy. The limiting factor is how do we make better use of the human brains, because they're not getting better over time. In fact, the population in the Western world at least is aging and in some cases shrinking. Right. So if anything, what we really need is more machines and more robots to try to continue to increase worker productivity so that we can continue to get wealthier as economies. Different in Africa and certain other parts of the world, where the huge issue there is dramatic increase in the population, but with an education system that is not preparing people for the jobs of the 21st century. But in our country, the real question is not, what happens when the robots take over. The real question is how can we get the robots to happen faster, because they're not really happening that fast today, so that we can re-accelerate productivity, which is the main driver of wealth creation in our economy, irrespective of income distribution, which is a big problem in this country and we need to solve. But that is not tied to the robots and AI. That's tied to fiscal policies and other types of policies that we need to put in place.
Gotcha on the AI, but just one reflection on, because you said what's not happening, meaning not the AI, but do you see the next 5 years as a kind of a critical time in kind of rethinking the systems around this independent workforce, or what do you expect that we're going to see come to a head here?
I think it is becoming critical, and the reason is because more and more of these freelancers will purely rely on freelancing. Either they will be single, no spouse and full-time freelancers, or they'll have a spouse who's also a full-time freelancer. So the current model where the ecosystem around freelancing is not as ideal as it needs to be, but it's okay because you've got this backup plan that is tied to employment, is progressively going to go away. So we need to figure out the model for freelancing, and that includes how education is delivered, it includes how benefits are delivered, it includes how financial services are delivered, and just about everything else that we take for granted as employees. And I would say particularly the education system. I would say freelancing is about the jobs of the 21st century, and companies still want to hire them as if we were in the 20th century, and our education system is stuck in the 19th century, because that's when it got designed. It got designed for the first industrial revolution, and we are now in the fourth industrial revolution, and we've got a limited amount of time before things start to really hurt, where people truly want to be freelancing, and it is the right thing for the economy, but the rest of the system is not catching up with them.
How confident are you that we're going to get through this and do? Are you optimistic about this process or not?
So I would say I'm very optimistic with financial services and benefits, because these are for-profit activities, and banks and the healthcare providers will figure out, hey, I can make money here, so I'm going to figure it out. I think the real challenge is how you fund lifelong learning. right? And there's various models. Singapore has one. The Scandinavian countries have another. The US doesn't have a system at all, for all I know. But there's various models that work in other countries, and we should probably start by studying them and really understanding why they work and why they don't. But a combination of the workers themselves setting money aside to plan for lifelong learning, governments building education accounts, putting money aside to allow people to choose how they want to train themselves, and then making companies accountable. If you fire a worker and that person doesn't find a job quickly, or a job that is as highly paid as the previous job was, then you've essentially created a negative externality on society. By not training people for their next job, you've hurt society, and yet you're not paying a price for it right now. Right? And so how do we build systems that are keeping each of the stakeholders accountable for jointly making sure that the workforce is fully educated and up to speed for the future? Because again, the scarce resource is human brains, and when a third of humans are being underutilized, we are really doing a disservice to society. We're not running out of jobs because we're not running out of problems to solve. I mean, if you just look at the United Nations, Sustainable Development Goals, where we need to fight poverty and fight disease and the water crisis and global warming, and there's 16 or 19 of those, we're not exactly running out of problems to solve. And we've got tons of people that are being underutilized. And the real question is, how do you make sure that we build education systems and the right funding and the right incentive structure to make sure that we utilize people to their full capacity?
I share your optimism. I hope you're right. And thanks so much for this conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Another great conversation here that really opened up the whole world of independent workers and a possible way forward. Thank you.
Thank you.